At the end of part 2 on Augustine's work on free will, we introduced a problem of freedom and foreknowledge, the foreknowledge of God and how that relates to our freedom, and does it eliminate our freedom? And what Augustine does is address this kind of an argument. Now, he obviously doesn't lay out the argument the way I'm laying it out here, but here's an argument that presents the problem more clearly. So whatever God foreknows will come to pass. It's a guarantee, it seems, because God can't be wrong. He only believes what is true, and if he knows something, it has to be true, so it will come to pass. So suppose God knows that Pettit will sin on Tuesday afternoon, okay? Then that means we have to take into account the fact that God is omniscient and God is never wrong in what God believes. So Pettit must sin Tuesday afternoon. That's of necessity. So what is done by necessity, though, is not done of free will, and that means Pettit does not sin by free will. But Augustine has already argued that it is free will that brings about sin. So this is a problem within that larger issue of the problem of evil that we're not really addressing squarely here, but it is clearly relevant to that topic. Okay, 2 responses. First is a little bit odd, you might think, but Augustine says, the most people who are bothered by this concern about free will and God's foreknowledge, they don't understand the answer because they do not ask in a pious fashion. In other words, they already don't believe in God. They already have that lack. And so they don't think it can be squared anyway. There's no chance of reconciling these things. And so that's why they're bothered by it. It's a reason for them not to believe in God, a reason for them to find a flaw in a theistic belief system. Well, okay, and that's a moral concern, right? Or a moral epistemology is what we're kind of talking about here. How our views of things can affect what we view of problems, philosophical problems. Okay, let's go on. The problem there is they already fail to trust in God. This reinforces their conclusion by raising this problem. Okay. Second, the argument assumes that everything that God has foreknowledge of is by necessity. And it does that. That is correct. But Augustine argues that this assumption is problematic. It's problematic because it implies that even God's future actions are by necessity. Now, Evodius is supposed to be a believer here, so he believes that God exists, that is, and believes the traditional characteristics of God. So God's future actions are by necessity and not done freely, but it's part of the theology that God acts freely. Free will is the ability to do what is right. And of course, God has the ability to do what is right. And God has free actions. That's part of the characteristic, the nature of God. So the assumption that anything that is foreknown is by necessity is problematic on that basis. Now, here's a puzzle to clarify. Suppose you desire to be happy. That's what you want. That's what you seek. And suppose that God makes you happy. Are you happy against your will in that situation? And of course, that's a rhetorical question with the answer being no. If God did it then, according to your reasoning, though it was by necessity, Augustine argues, that Evodius would have to say it was by necessity, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So if God foreknows what you're going to will, that does not mean that you do not will anything. So God's foreknowledge does not rob you of your ability to will. And your ability to will is something that is done freely. Okay, so let's talk about the will a little bit more carefully here. By speaking of willing necessarily, you actually take away willing entirely. You don't will at all if you're willing necessarily. That phrase doesn't really make sense, Augustine argues. If we have will, it's in our power to do something. We will exercise our wills in the future because God knows what we will do. That's okay. Is the problem of free will then different because it's related to God? Is the problem of free will and foreknowledge special because it's the foreknowledge of God? And Evodius says yes to that question. But Augustine goes on to turn it on another question on for Evodius to address. If you know that someone will do something, suppose you know that someone's going to be offered a bribe and you know that person will reject the bribe. Now, does that mean that the person lacks free will? Okay, you might go either direction there. Evodius says that it would mean that the person lacks free will, as long as it's truly knowledge, right? Evodius' view here is, if I really know that the person's going to not take the bribe, and then that's true knowledge, that the person doesn't have free will. Now, Augustine responds, well, wait a minute, let's think more carefully about this. You do not compel the person to sin. So suppose it's the opposite is the illustration that I just described. You know, a person, if they're offered $1 million bribe to do something minor, you know they will take it, say. You do not compel the person to sin. You simply know it will happen. It's not your compulsion, right? It's not you that's causing the person to do it. You don't take away the person's free will by having knowledge of what they're going to do. It's still their free will. And likewise, Augustine argues, is the same with God. Your knowledge of the past, for example, does not compel the past to be a certain way. Similarly, God's foreknowledge does not compel the future to be a certain way. It doesn't, we might introduce cause here. God's foreknowledge does not cause the future to be a certain way. Okay, so one more concern. If that is all true, why didn't God make it such that our free will always freely did what is right? This is certainly reminiscent of J.L. Mackie and his views on the problem of evil and the free will defense to that problem. Now, Augustine responds, now let's go back, think about what is the nature of good and how it applies in different situations. Would you lament that a nut is not perfectly spherical because you're aware of perfect sphericity? So suppose you have a walnut, you can tell it's not perfectly spherical. And so would you say, well, that's a terrible problem with the walnut because it's not perfectly spherical? Just because there may be creatures who always freely will the good. So that's a possibility. Augustine says maybe angels would fit that category. That doesn't mean that God should not make some lower creatures who have free will, but do not always will the good. And that obviously would be humans. So just because humans aren't maybe as good as they possibly could be, doesn't mean that they're not good and their existence is not good, and it's not good to have humans. Lamenting the misuse of free will of humans is to lament the existence of humans, argues Augustine. And so to expand that a little bit, have some final thoughts here. An errant horse is still better than a stone that doesn't err. Right? A horse that is a problem and runs away from time to time, it's still better than a stone that never has that kind of a problem. The stone never runs away, right? A drunkard is better than the wine, has more value than the wine. And Augustine ends with this final thought. There's still hope for the sinner, someone who is constantly misusing their free will and rejecting God. And there is still the way of salvation available for that person. So there's hope, so that person still has value, and it is good that the person exists.